Chapter 1, 0 Hour. The first signs of the blackout weren't obvious. At first, it was just a momentary flicker, blips in the financial markets, delays in encrypted messages, power fluctuations in seemingly unrelated locations. It wasn't until every secure line went dark and the world's intelligence networks realized they had lost control that the full scale of the attack became clear. Jasper Hawke had seen his fair share of global crises, but nothing like this. Sitting in a dimly lit safe house in Berlin, he watched the encrypted laptop screen flash red as one communication channel after another collapsed. The last message that had made it through before the blackout was simple, but chilling. Directive in motion. Confirm status. Midnight hours. Then silence. Hawke exhaled slowly, his sharp eyes scanning the screen, mind racing. He didn't believe in coincidences. This wasn't just a cyber attack. This was an act of war. His instincts told him two things. Someone had just crippled the world's intelligence grid, and whoever was behind it knew exactly what they were doing. And now it was up to him to stop them. Hawke shut the laptop with a quiet click and leaned back in his chair. The safe house, a nondescript apartment in Berlin's Kreuzberg district, was quiet, save for the distant hum of street traffic. It wasn't his first time here. The place had been used before, mostly as a dead drop site or a temporary base for undercover agents passing through. Tonight, it was his war room. He reached for his phone, a secure satellite model with its own independent network, or at least it was supposed to be. When he pressed the call button, the line stayed dead. That confirmed it. Whoever had launched this attack hadn't just targeted government institutions. They'd taken out encrypted networks, independent satellites, and even black market communication channels. The entire global intelligence community had been blinded in one swift move. That was when Hawke heard it, a faint shuffle outside the door. Years of experience kicked in. He was off his chair in a second, moving silently across the room. His Glock was already in his hand, safety off, barrel aimed toward the door. Another noise, a floorboard creaking. They were coming. Hawke pressed himself against the wall, listening. There was no knock, no warning, just the unmistakable sound of a lock being picked. Someone had found him, and they weren't here for a friendly chat. The lock clicked open. The door inched forward. Hawke moved fast. He grabbed the edge of the door and yanked it open, pulling the intruder inside. Before the man could react, Hawke drove his elbow into the side of his head, sending him stumbling backward. A second attacker was right behind him. This one was faster. He lunged, swinging a knife in a tight arc. Hawke ducked, grabbing the man's wrist and twisting hard. The blade clattered to the floor. A split second later, Hawke slammed his knee into the attacker's ribs and sent him crashing into the coffee table. The first man, recovering from the blow, reached for a gun. Hawke didn't give him the chance. A single shot from his Glock dropped him instantly. The second man groaned on the floor, dazed but alive. Hawke crouched beside him, grabbing a fistful of his collar. "Who sent you?" The man spat blood onto the floor. "You're already too late." Hawke pressed the barrel of his gun against the man's temple. "Try again." The attacker chuckled, his lips curling into a grin. "It's already begun." Then, before Hawke could react, the man bit down hard. A sickening crunch. His body convulsed. Hawke swore and yanked him back, but it was too late. Cyanide capsule. The man was dead in seconds. Hawke let out a slow breath, adrenaline still surging through his veins. He searched both bodies, finding no IDs, no distinguishing marks. Just ghosts, sent to kill him before he could dig any deeper. He glanced at the laptop on the table. The Blackout Directive had begun. And if someone was willing to kill to keep him out of it, that meant he was on the right trail. Chapter 2: Ghost Signals. Berlin never slept. Even at this hour, the city pulsed with a quiet, unshakable rhythm. Cars gliding through wet streets, neon lights reflecting in puddles, distant voices carried by the wind. It was a city of secrets, and tonight, Jasper Hawke was buried deep in one. He stood over the dead man's body, exhaling slowly. His pulse had steadied, but his mind was moving faster than ever. The two attackers weren't just hired guns. They had been sent by someone who knew exactly where to find him. The enemy had eyes on him. Hawke crouched and searched the second man's pockets. Nothing useful, no phone, no ID. Just a single metallic key with an engraving, SVR 029. Russian. Maybe. But there was no time for speculation. He pocketed the key and pulled out his burner phone. No signal. Every encrypted network was still dark. That meant his usual contacts were unreachable, which left him one option. Hawke moved quickly, slipping out of the safe house through the rear exit. The cold air bit at his skin as he disappeared into the Berlin night. He knew better than to hail a cab, too easy to track. Instead, he walked for 4 blocks before ducking into an underground U-Bahn station, blending into the late-night commuters. His destination was clear. The Kaiserhof Hotel. On the surface, it was a 5-star luxury hotel for diplomats, politicians, and the occasional billionaire. But Hawke knew it for what it really was, a hub for intelligence operatives who needed a neutral ground for off-the-record meetings. And tonight, he needed an off-the-record conversation with an old acquaintance. The lobby was exactly as he remembered, pristine, elegant, and dripping with the kind of wealth that masked the real power struggles happening behind closed doors. He walked past the concierge without hesitation, heading straight for the bar on the 2nd floor. He spotted his contact immediately. Lena Volkova, former FSB, now a broker of information. If something was happening in the world of intelligence, Lena either knew about it or was selling it to the highest bidder. She was seated in a booth, swirling a glass of whiskey, her eyes flicking up as he approached. Well, she murmured. If it isn't Jasper Hawke. The last time I saw you, someone was trying to kill you. Hawke slid into the seat across from her. Not much has changed. Lena smirked, but her eyes were sharp. I heard about the blackout. The entire world's intelligence network has gone blind. And yet, somehow you're still moving. That tells me one thing. Hawke waited. Lena leaned forward. You know something. He placed the metallic key on the table between them. I need to know where this came from. She eyed it, her fingers brushing over the engraving. Then she let out a low whistle. SVR 029, she mused. That's not just Russian. That's Zmaevich. Hawke's expression didn't change, but inside, something clicked. Zmaevich was a covert faction within Russian intelligence. Off-the-books operatives who answered to no one but their own hidden agenda. Even Moscow had trouble controlling them. If they were involved in the blackout, this wasn't just a cyber attack. It was a power play. Lena tapped the key against the table. This is a clearance token. It grants access to a specific location, a safe house, a storage unit, maybe a command post. Either way, someone gave it to those men for a reason. Where? Hawke asked. Lena sighed, finishing her drink. There's an underground data vault beneath an old Soviet facility in Warsaw. It's been inactive for years, but rumors say certain groups still use it. If I had to bet, I'd say that's where your key leads. Hawke took the key back and stood. Careful, Jasper, Lena said, watching him. Warsaw isn't friendly territory for someone like you. Hawke gave a small, knowing smile. It never is. Then he was gone. Chapter 3, The Warsaw Gambit. Warsaw was colder than Berlin, and tonight, the air carried the kind of chill that seeped into a man's bones. Jasper Hawke stepped out of the railway station, pulling his coat tighter as he merged into the late-night crowd. He had taken the train instead of flying. Less scrutiny, fewer digital footprints. He had also swapped identities twice along the way, using old tradecraft tricks to stay ahead of anyone watching. If Zmajevic was behind the blackout, they wouldn't let him waltz into their operation unnoticed. Hawke had no intention of making their job easier. The facility, the address Lena had given him, led to an abandoned Soviet-era textile factory on the outskirts of the city. From the outside, it looked like it hadn't seen activity in decades. Cracked walls, shattered windows, rusted fences. But Hawke wasn't fooled. The real site wasn't above ground at a quarter-mile from the factory. He found what he was looking for. A service tunnel, concealed beneath an overgrown lot. The entrance was locked with an old iron grate, but the SVR-029 key fit perfectly. Click. The gate swung open, revealing a set of concrete stairs that disappeared into darkness. Hawke pulled a small tactical flashlight from his pocket, sweeping the beam across the walls. Old Soviet markings, moisture stains, exposed pipes. This was the kind of place built to outlive governments. That he descended in silence. Below the surface, at the bottom of the stairs, the tunnel stretched forward, lined with flickering industrial lights. He moved cautiously, keeping close to the walls. About 30 meters in, the corridor split. One path led to an old maintenance shaft. The other led to a reinforced steel door. Bingo. Hawke studied the panel beside the door, biometric scanner, keypad, and an old-fashioned keyhole. He inserted the SVR-029 key, and the system chirped in recognition. The lock hissed, then clicked open. He stepped inside. The room beyond was small, but its importance was undeniable. A command center, buried deep underground. Banks of outdated servers lined the walls, still running. The air was stale, filled with the low hum of machines. At the far end of the room, a single workstation was active. Hawke approached, scanning the screen. The interface was crude, old Soviet-era encryption, overlaid with modern code. Someone had repurposed this place, turning it into a secure data hub. And then he saw it. A transmission log. Hawke's eyes narrowed as he scrolled through the records. The system had relayed a massive data burst just before the global blackout. Coordinates, coded messages, financial transactions. He wasn't looking at just a cyber attack. He was looking at a blueprint for global destabilization. Before he could process further, something changed. A red warning flashed across the screen. Unauthorized access detected. The moment Hawke read it, he knew. They were already coming for him. The ambush. A metallic clank echoed from the corridor. Footsteps. Hawke moved fast, shutting down the console and drawing his pistol. He flattened himself against the wall just as the door burst open. Two men in tactical gear stormed in. Rifles raised, Hawke fired first. His silenced rounds struck clean, one in the throat, the other in the chest. Both men dropped before they could even react. But there would be more. He swept their gear for anything useful. One of them had an encrypted comm device. Hawke pocketed it and slipped back into the corridor. Just as he did, more voices echoed from the far end. They weren't here to take prisoners. Hawke sprinted toward the maintenance shaft, his instincts screaming at him to move faster. He reached it just as automatic fire shredded the walls behind him. Concrete exploded in a shower of dust and debris. No time to hesitate. He leapt down the shaft, catching a rusted ladder and sliding several meters before dropping into the underground sewer line. The stench was overpowering, but Hawke didn't stop. He ran, following the tunnels until he found an exit grate leading back to the streets of Warsaw. As he emerged, he didn't stop moving. This was bigger than he had realized. The blackout was just the first phase, and whatever came next would be far worse. Chapter 4: Ghosts of the Cold War. Hawke didn't stop running until he was several blocks from the abandoned factory. The frigid Warsaw air burned his lungs, but he ignored it. He had gotten what he came for, confirmation that the blackout was part of something much bigger. Now, he needed answers, and there was only one man in the world who could give them to him: the spy master. Hawke knew that calling Nikolai Vasilev was a risk. The former KGB director had more enemies than friends, but his knowledge of underground networks, both past and present, was unrivaled. Finding him, however, required a different kind of tradecraft. At a small cafe in Warsaw's Old Town, Hawke left a single red chess piece on an outdoor table before vanishing into the night. It was an old signal from their Cold War days, one that meant, "We need to talk. Now." Hours later, at precisely 2 a.m., Hawke received a single text on his burner phone. Lazienki Park. The palace on the water. Come alone. He ditched the phone and moved. A meeting in the dark. Lazienki Park was deserted at this hour. The grand palace on the water stood illuminated by moonlight, its reflection shimmering in the lake below. A perfect meeting place, secluded, open enough to detect surveillance. Hawke spotted Nikolai Vasilev standing near the stone balustrade, hands clasped behind his back. He looked older than the last time they had met, his frame thinner, his face lined with deep creases, but his eyes, sharp as ever, betrayed nothing. "You're getting reckless, Jasper," Vasilev said without turning. "I don't have time for games," Hawke replied. "I need to know about Zmayevich." Vasilev finally turned, his expression unreadable. "Zmayevich isn't a man," he said. "It's an operation." Hawke frowned. "Explain." Vasilev sighed, as if burdened by the weight of his own knowledge. Zmayevich was first conceived in the final years of the Cold War, a contingency plan for economic and cyber warfare, a failsafe in case the Soviet Union ever needed to collapse the West without firing a single shot. "But the USSR is gone," Hawke said. "And yet the plan lives on." Vasilev reached into his coat and handed Hawke a small USB drive. "Inside, you'll find financial transactions linked to the attack. Someone has reactivated Zmayevich, and if they've already pulled the trigger on the blackout, that means they're moving to the next phase." Hawke studied the drive. "Who's running it?" That's what you'll have to find out, Vasilev said. But I can give you a name. Hawke tensed. Vasilev's voice was quiet but deadly serious. Krulov, the assassin's shadow. Before Hawke could respond, something changed. A faint rustle in the trees. The soft click of a suppressed rifle. Sniper. Hawke didn't hesitate. He lunged, slamming into Vasilev just as the first shot cracked through the night. The bullet whizzed past, striking the stone railing where Vasilev had been standing. More shots followed. Hawke rolled, drawing his pistol and scanning the shadows. He caught a glimpse of a silhouetted figure perched in a nearby tree. Black tactical gear, precision rifle, no wasted movement. This wasn't a random hit. This was a professional kill order. Another shot rang out. Hawke fired back, forcing the sniper to shift positions. But he knew he was outmatched in a long-range fight. They needed to move. Now. Can you run? He barked at Vasilev. I'm old. Not dead, Vasilev growled. Hawke grabbed him and darted toward the stone archways leading out of the park. Another shot kicked up marble dust behind them. They had seconds before the sniper recalibrated. A black sedan sat idling near the exit. A getaway vehicle. The shooter wasn't alone. Hawke turned to Vasilev. Do you trust me? Vasilev smirked. That depends. Hawke didn't wait for the answer. He shoved the spymaster into the lake. The cold water would conceal them better than any alleyway. And by the time the shooter figured it out, Hawke was already charging toward the sedan. Interrogating the driver never saw it coming. Hawke reached the car before the man could react. He yanked open the door, dragged him out, and slammed him against the hood. Who sent you? Hawke hissed. The man struggled, but Hawke twisted his arm hard enough to make him grimace in pain. You're wasting time, Hawke warned. Your sniper's going to kill you next. The man hesitated. He knew Hawke wasn't lying. Krulov. He finally gasped. Hawke's blood ran cold, so it was true. Krulov was pulling the strings, but before he could press further, a final gunshot rang out. The driver stiffened, eyes wide, before slumping lifelessly against the car. The sniper had cleaned up his loose ends. Hawke ducked just as another round shattered the windshield. Time to go. Vanishing into the night, Hawke sprinted back toward the lake. Vasilev was already pulling himself onto the shore, dripping wet but very much alive. We need to move, Hawke said. Vasilev nodded, wiping water from his face. Where? Hawke glanced back at the empty park, then at the USB drive still clutched in his hand. We follow the money, he said. We find Krulov, and if Krulov was running Zmayevich, then the blackout was only the beginning. Chapter 5. The Silent War. The night was thick with silence as Hawke and Vasilev navigated through the dark streets of Warsaw. The sudden ambush had changed everything. The sniper, a professional with deadly accuracy, had been part of something much bigger, and now Krulov was their only lead. They couldn't afford to waste time. The Zmayevich operation was on the brink of catastrophe. They needed to think fast. A cold trail, back at their hideout, a modest, secure apartment in the heart of the city. Hawke sat across from Vasilev. The flicker of a low-burning lamp cast long shadows on the walls. He plugged the USB drive into his laptop, the faint hum of the machine the only sound in the room. Vasilev, still dripping water from his hasty retreat, leaned against the wall, arms crossed. His eyes remained cold, calculating. "What do we have?" he asked. Hawke scanned through the files on the drive. The information was encrypted, but it was clear enough that there was a connection between the cyber attack and a series of high-profile financial markets. Banks, corporations, and global trading hubs. This was no mere attack. This was an economic collapse in the making. Hawke leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "It's all tied to Krulov, but the connections are deeper than I thought. Zmaevich isn't just an isolated operation. It's a network, an entire infrastructure built to control global finances." Vasilev's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Hawke's fingers hovered over the keyboard. "This isn't just about money. They're manipulating the stock markets, triggering crashes, creating instability. The goal isn't just financial ruin. It's to destabilize entire governments." "That sounds like a Cold War tactic," Vasilev said, a note of recognition in his voice. "An old playbook, reactivated for a new world." "That's exactly what it is," Hawke replied. "But there's more. This wasn't supposed to happen. Whoever is behind it is making moves that even Krulov didn't anticipate. A deadly game. The file Hawke was analyzing revealed several key players: shadow corporations, shell companies, and elite individuals who were laundering money across borders. Each transaction, each step was carefully calculated to provoke instability. A carefully orchestrated domino effect. "What happens next?" Vasilev asked, stepping closer. Hawke's fingers danced over the keyboard, decrypting the final file on the drive. A name appeared on the screen. A name that sent a chill down Hawke's spine. ***, Valentina Orlova. Vasilev's face twisted with disgust. "Her. I should have known." "You know her?" Hawke asked, glancing at the Russian spymaster. "She was KGB, part of the old guard," Vasilev muttered. "A specialist in subversive operations. When the USSR collapsed, she disappeared, but her fingerprints were all over secret deals, destabilization tactics. If she's involved with Krulov..." His voice trailed off. Hawke had heard of Orlova, a master manipulator, a woman whose cunning rivaled that of the best spies in history. She was a ghost in the intelligence community, rumored to be controlling everything from underground trade to covert military movements. He closed the laptop, a sense of finality settling over him. "We need to find her. She's the key to everything." The trail to Moscow. They couldn't waste any more time. With every passing hour, the global markets teetered on the edge of collapse, and the cyber attack's effects rippled through the world. Their next step was clear: Moscow, Orlova's last known location. "Do we have a plan?" Vasilev asked. Hawke nodded. "We'll have to get in quietly. Orlova's network has eyes everywhere. But I know a place. An old contact who might know where she's hiding." Vasilev raised an eyebrow. "A contact?" Hawke's lips curled into a grim smile. "A very old one. But if anyone knows Orlova's movements, it's him." In the belly of the beast, the flight to Moscow was a blur. Hawke kept to himself, sorting through every piece of intel he had gathered so far. As they approached the city, he began to form a clearer picture. Krulov, a name that had once been nothing more than a shadow in the intelligence world, was now front and center in an operation that threatened the world's very foundation. They landed under the cover of darkness, and within hours, they were on their way to a secluded safe house in the outskirts of the city. This was where Hawke's contact was supposed to meet them. He didn't know much about the man, other than that he had been a former FSB officer who had defected years ago. The place was a rundown apartment building, the kind you would never notice unless you knew what to look for. The door creaked open as Hawke knocked 3 times. His eyes scanning the dimly lit hallway, and a tall figure appeared at the door. It was Alexei, a man in his late 50s, his once sharp features now worn with age. His cold eyes still held the intensity of a man who had lived through the darkest of times. "Hawke," Alexei said, his voice low and thick with suspicion. "I didn't expect you. Things are moving faster than we thought," Hawke replied, stepping inside. Vasilev followed, his gaze darting across the small room, his instincts never letting down. "Do you have the information?" Alexei didn't waste time. He pulled out a small stack of papers and slid them across the table to Hawke. "The name you seek," Alexei began, his voice tense, "is hidden in plain sight, but you'll need more than this to find her." Hawke flipped through the pages, his mind racing. He was getting closer. Orlova wasn't just hiding in Moscow. She had deep ties to Moscow's financial district, where black market money flowed freely. "I know where to go," Hawke said, standing up abruptly. Alexei looked him dead in the eye. "Be careful, Hawke. Orlova won't go down easy, and neither will Krulov. A dangerous path." Hawke didn't respond. He didn't need to. He knew exactly what he was up against. And when the stakes were this high, there was no room for hesitation. Tomorrow, they would take the fight to Moscow's heart. And this time, they would not only face Orlova and Krulov, but the vast network they had built to control the world's future. Chapter 6. The Kremlin's Shadow. The city of Moscow hummed with the quiet efficiency of a well-oiled machine. Its streets lined with sleek, black sedans that passed by without a hint of hesitation. The night was bitterly cold, but the city was alive. Inside the safe house, the ticking of an old clock was the only sound that marked the passing of time. Hawke stood by the window, staring out into the darkness. The Russian capital sprawled before him, a sprawling web of alleys, towering skyscrapers, and clandestine operations. Somewhere out there, Orlova was pulling the strings, but he could feel her presence like a shadow just out of reach. Vasilev walked in quietly, his boots making little noise on the cold floor. His eyes were sharp, calculating. The Kremlin isn't far from here. If Orlova's network has ties to the financial district, then she's likely embedded somewhere within the city's elite. We can't afford to waste time. Hawke nodded but didn't break his gaze from the window. The cold wind from the street slipped through the cracks of the window, brushing against his skin. His mind raced through the possibilities. The operation had grown more complex with each hour. Krulov, Orlova, and the cyber attack had now converged into a single monstrous entity, one that threatened not just Moscow but the entire world. "I know a way in," Hawke finally said, turning around. His eyes met Vasilev's. "But it won't be easy." Into the belly of the beast. Their plan was simple yet perilous. Infiltrate a high-profile gala taking place at one of the Kremlin's most secure buildings, a fortress of power and influence. It was an event attended by the wealthiest members of Russian society, politicians, and businessmen. Orlova's ties to the elite were well documented, and it was here that they would find their first real lead. Hawke didn't trust the idea, but it was the best option they had. Orlova wouldn't make an appearance directly, but her presence would be felt. The guests at the gala were more than just high society. They were the ones pulling the strings, orchestrating the collapse of global financial markets. The pair suited up, blending into the night like shadows. Hawke's mind flickered to the past, to the countless missions that had led him here. None of them had ever been easy, but this was different. This mission was personal. They arrived at the venue, a palatial structure that gleamed under the lights, a symbol of Russia's power and opulence. The guards at the entrance barely glanced at them as they flashed their fake IDs, their demeanor professional but not overly attentive. This wasn't the first time Hawke had infiltrated such events. He knew exactly how to move unnoticed in a sea of expensive suits and extravagant gowns. The Russian elite. Inside, the gala was in full swing. Hawke scanned the room, his eyes sweeping across the crowd of politicians, businessmen, and spies. It wasn't hard to spot the ones with the most power. They wore subtle but impeccably tailored suits and carried themselves with the arrogance of those who controlled the world behind closed doors. These were the people who funded operations like Zmayevich and pulled the strings on a global scale. "Look for any signs of Orlova's associates," Hawke murmured to Vasilev. "They'll be here." Vasilev nodded, his eyes scanning the room with precision. As a former FSB officer, he was trained to notice the smallest details, the flickers of movement that others would miss. For a moment, the two men blended in seamlessly with the crowd. Two shadows in a sea of power. The first encounter, Hawke moved through the crowd, his gaze never stopping for too long on anyone. He could feel the weight of the place, the suffocating air of deception and lies. He hated it. It reminded him too much of the old days. The days when he would slip into these events unnoticed, gather information, and disappear before anyone even knew he had been there. As he walked past a group of businessmen, he caught sight of a familiar face. It was Maxim Volkov, a man he had once tracked years ago in a completely different operation. Volkov had a reputation as a kingmaker in the Russian financial world, but more importantly, he had ties to Orlova's network. Hawke made his way toward him, Vasilev trailing a few steps behind. Volkov was speaking to a woman, his back turned to Hawke as he ordered drinks for his group. "Maxim," Hawke said, his voice steady but cold. Volkov turned slowly, his face hardening as his gaze met Hawke's. Recognition flickered in his eyes before he masked it with a forced smile. "Hawke," Volkov said, his voice smooth, too smooth. "I should have known you would show up eventually." "You've got a good memory," Hawke replied, his tone neutral. "Still playing in the shadows, I see." Volkov's smile faltered. "I've always preferred the shadows. But you've always been better at that, haven't you?" Hawke didn't flinch. "I'm here for one reason, Maxim. Orlova." Volkov's expression shifted slightly, the barest hint of fear in his eyes before he composed himself. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I think you do," Hawke pressed. "You're too close to her operation. You can either help me, or you can get in my way." Volkov let out a low laugh. "I don't think you understand, Hawke. Orlova doesn't need your help, and you certainly won't get in her way. You should leave while you still can." Hawke leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "I don't have time for games, Volkov. This isn't a negotiation." For a moment, the tension between them was palpable. But then Volkov's expression softened, almost imperceptibly. "She's already gone," he said quietly, "and there's nothing you can do to stop what's coming." Hawke stood there for a moment, processing Volkov's words. Something was off. Orlova had been here, but now she was gone, vanished into the shadows once more. Hawke straightened up, a grim realization settling in. Volkov wasn't just a player in the game, he was a pawn. And the game was far from over. Chasing shadows, Volkov's words lingered in the air as Hawke turned away from him, his mind racing. Orlova had moved. She wasn't at the gala anymore, but her network was still here, and someone had to know where she was. "I'm going to find her," Hawke muttered to Vasilev. They made their way through the crowd, the clock ticking. The night was far from over, and the stakes had just been raised. Chapter 7. The game shifts. The cold night air sliced through the cracks of the car window, but inside, Hawke sat in an almost unnatural calm. His eyes were fixed on the cityscape, the lights of Moscow blurring into streaks of neon. He had only one objective now: find Orlova. But as the hours passed and Volkov's cryptic warning echoed in his mind, it became clear the game had changed. "She's gone, Hawke," Vasilev muttered, the frustration in his voice barely masked. "Volkov wouldn't lie about something like that." "I don't think he's lying," Hawke replied, his voice low, almost contemplative. "But she's still here, somewhere." The Kremlin loomed in the distance, a monolith of power casting a long shadow over the city. It was impossible to imagine that a woman like Orlova, as ruthless and calculating as she was, would simply vanish into thin air. But Hawke knew that the more desperate he became, the more unpredictable she would be. The car pulled up to a low, unmarked building on the outskirts of the city. Vasilev handed the driver a slip of paper, the final destination for the night. A hidden bunker. They'd been monitoring the area for days, tracing digital footprints that led them here. It was the last place anyone would think to look for Orlova, but Hawke wasn't in the mood for assumptions. The hidden bunker. They entered the building through a side door, slipping past the few guards stationed at the main entrance. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old machinery and stale cigarettes. The flickering lights above cast long shadows along the narrow hallways. It was a far cry from the sleek, high-tech environments that Orlova usually operated from, but in a way that made it even more dangerous. "Stay close," Hawke instructed in a hushed tone as they descended into the underground bunker. Orlova wouldn't be here without a reason. The walls of the bunker were lined with concrete, and the further they went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. Every sound echoed through the narrow passages, every footstep, every breath. Finally, they reached a large door, its surface steel and cold. There was no lock, but a small keypad beside it with a series of glowing buttons. Vasilev stepped forward, tapping in a series of commands. The door slid open with a soft hiss, revealing a room that felt almost like a command center. Inside, there was a mess of wires and computer terminals, a far cry from the clean, orderly world of high finance that Orlova inhabited. It was clear now this wasn't just a hideout. It was a hub. Hawke's eyes scanned the room. There were data servers stacked high against the walls, flashing with activity. Small drones were hovering near the ceiling, keeping watch over the space. And then there was the most chilling sight. a digital map of the world with highlighted regions flashing red. Markets, countries, and key financial hubs were under attack. "This is it," Hawke muttered under his breath. "The digital nexus." Vasilev moved toward one of the terminals, quickly accessing the system. His fingers danced over the keys with practiced precision, his eyes scanning the screen for any useful data. It wasn't long before he froze. The data they had uncovered wasn't just information, it was a blueprint for global destruction. Orlova had been playing a game much bigger than anyone had anticipated. This was no longer about money or politics, it was about control. Complete worldwide control. "She's manipulating the global markets," Vasilev whispered, his voice tight. "She's using the cyber attack to create a financial collapse. If she succeeds, she'll have enough power to rewrite entire economies." Hawke's gut clenched. They had been on the defensive the entire time. The attack wasn't just an isolated event. It was a catalyst, a tool to launch something much more dangerous. "What's the endgame?" Hawke asked, his voice grim. "The chaos she's created will trigger a worldwide recession," Vasilev answered. "But it's more than that. The countries most affected will fall into debt, giving Orlova the leverage to control them. She's using the attack to destabilize governments, to bring down the financial giants of the world." Hawke clenched his fists. It was clear now. This wasn't just about revenge or a personal vendetta. Orlova was trying to ignite a new world order, one built on fear and manipulation. "She's already made her move," Vasilev continued, pointing to a series of targets highlighted on the map. "The largest stock exchanges are already under siege. In the next few days, it'll spread to the oil markets, the currency exchange, and the banking systems." "Where is she now?" Hawke asked, his eyes narrowing. Vasilev was already moving again, his fingers flying over the keyboard. "There's a secure data transfer happening right now," he muttered. "She's sending the final piece of the puzzle to someone." The betrayal unveiled. The seconds stretched on as Vasilev worked, sweat beading on his forehead. Hawke could feel the tension building. If they didn't act fast, the entire global financial system would crumble beneath their feet. The only thing more dangerous than the attack itself was the people backing it. Finally, Vasilev looked up, his face pale. "I've got her," he said, his voice trembling with shock. "Orlova's transfer is going to Krulov." Hawke froze. The name hit him like a punch to the gut. Krulov, the man he had spent years hunting, the mastermind behind the global network of arms dealers, traffickers, and corrupt politicians. The very man who had orchestrated Hawke's downfall in the past. "I should have known," Hawke muttered, his voice low. "It was never just about Orlova." A dangerous gamble. The news felt like a sharp turn down a dark alley. Krulov wasn't just some distant figure in the shadows. He was at the heart of it all. And now everything made sense. Orlova had been a pawn, her actions orchestrated by the same forces Hawke had been chasing for years. "You'll have to make a choice now," Vasilev said, his eyes locked on the screen. "If you want to stop this, you'll have to go after Krulov." Hawke's mind raced. He had no choice. This was the moment, the one he had been preparing for, the one that would end everything. Krulov, Orlova, the global markets, all of it had come down to this. Chapter 8. The final countdown. Hawke stared at the map, his mind racing through the possibilities. Krulov's name hung in the air like a death sentence. The man wasn't just a player in this game, he was the game itself. Hawke had tangled with Krulov before, and each encounter left more scars than the last. But now, with everything on the line, there was no room for hesitation. This was his moment, and it had to be handled with surgical precision. "You know where he is?" Hawke asked, his voice steady, despite the storm raging inside him. Vasilev nodded, his face pale but resolute. "He's hidden, Hawke, deep in the mountains of the Caucasus. His compound is nearly impenetrable. It's been fortified with military-grade security." Hawke exhaled slowly, his fingers running over the edge of the table, tracing the lines of the map. Krulov's compound would be nearly impossible to infiltrate without the right support, and the clock was ticking down. The global financial system was on the verge of collapse, and Orlova's network was spreading like wildfire. They had no time to waste. "The journey begins." The helicopter roared to life as it lifted off the ground, the blades slicing through the cold air with a deep, steady hum. Hawke sat in the back, eyes locked on the mountainous horizon. His team had been assembled quickly: Vasilev, a communications expert named Katerina, and a field medic called Markov. Each had their role to play, but it was clear that the operation hinged on Hawke himself. "Good luck, Hawke," Vasilev said as he fastened his harness, a grim expression on his face. "You'll need it." "I don't need luck," Hawke replied, his voice a low growl. "I just need to get it done." The mountains loomed closer as the helicopter sliced through the air. The weather was starting to turn, a heavy mist rolling down from the peaks, shrouding everything in an eerie blanket of gray. As they neared the compound's location, Hawke's senses went into overdrive. He could feel the tension building in the pit of his stomach, the weight of the mission pressing down on him. The compound. The helicopter touched down in a clearing just outside the compound, the sound of the blades cutting through the air deafening. Hawke's boots hit the ground with a soft thud, his eyes immediately scanning the area for any signs of movement. The compound sat at the base of a mountain, an imposing structure of concrete and steel. "Stay sharp," Hawke ordered as he gestured for the team to move out. The plan was simple: infiltrate the compound, neutralize the guards, and locate Krulov. Once they had him, they'd shut down the operation and stop the cyber attack for good. The compound was surrounded by high fences and guard towers, but Hawke had been in worse situations before. They were ready. He could feel the adrenaline starting to pump through his veins as they approached the outer perimeter. Katerina pulled up her comms device, her voice low and steady. "We've got 2 guards on the north side. I'll take them out silently." Hawke nodded, then signaled to Markov to move in on the west side. He'd have to trust his team to do their jobs. This wasn't about brute force, it was about precision, about making every move count. The next few minutes felt like hours. The guards were unaware of their presence, too busy scanning the horizon for any incoming threats. Katerina and Markov moved with practiced ease, neutralizing the sentries before they even had a chance to react. "Clear," Katerina whispered into the comms. "Moving in," Hawke replied, his voice as cold as the air around them. The inner stronghold. Once inside the compound, the true challenge began. The halls were dark, the air heavy with the scent of stale air and the hum of industrial machinery. The place was a fortress, high-tech security, motion sensors, infrared cameras. But Hawke was no stranger to this kind of operation. He knew how to stay one step ahead. They moved swiftly through the compound, staying in the shadows, avoiding detection at every turn. Hawke could feel the tension building with each step closer to Krulov. This was it. They were on the cusp of ending this nightmare. The confrontation. They reached the heart of the compound, the control room. The doors were reinforced, but Hawke was already steps ahead. He gestured for Markov to set charges on the door while Katerina covered their six. As the charges detonated with a soft thud, the door flew open, revealing a room filled with monitors, servers, and the steady hum of technology. And there he was. Krulov. He was seated at the far end of the room, his back to them, focused on a series of screens. His cold, calculating eyes flicked toward them as they entered, his lips curling into a knowing smile. "I was wondering when you'd show up, Hawke," Krulov said, his voice smooth, almost amused. "You've been following me for years. How does it feel to finally catch up?" Hawke didn't answer. He stepped forward, his gun aimed at Krulov's chest. His heart pounded, but his hands were steady. He'd faced death more times than he cared to remember, but something about this, something about Krulov's twisted smile, pushed him to the edge. "You're not getting away this time," Hawke said, his voice steady. Krulov's smile widened. "You think you're the one in control here, Hawke? You think I'm the one you've been hunting?" He leaned back in his chair, hands behind his head. "You're just a pawn in this game. You've been part of my plan from the very beginning." Hawke's mind spun. What the hell was Krulov talking about? "You don't get it, do you?" Krulov continued. "I've been manipulating you this entire time. You've been playing right into my hands, helping me bring this global collapse about. You think you're stopping me, but in reality, you've already made sure that the chaos I've planned will spread beyond control." Hawke's pulse quickened. This was a trap. The cyber attack, the global markets, the manipulation, it had all been part of Krulov's plan from the start. He hadn't just been chasing a ghost. He'd been setting the stage for something much, much larger. "You've lost, Hawke," Krulov said, a dark satisfaction in his eyes. "The world is mine now." But Hawke wasn't finished. This game wasn't over yet. Chapter 9. The final betrayal. The air in the control room was thick with tension. Hawke stood frozen for a moment, his gun trained on Krulov, the weight of his words sinking deep into his mind. Every fiber of his being screamed that something was wrong, but he couldn't quite place it. Krulov's smug expression was a mask, and beneath it, Hawke could feel the stirrings of something much darker. "You've lost, Hawke," Krulov repeated, leaning forward now, his hands resting casually on the desk. "You think you're here to stop me, but all you've really done is help me get closer to my goal." Hawke's mind raced. The pieces were falling into place, but he couldn't make sense of it all. There was no way Krulov could be in control of everything. This had to be a manipulation, some final play to break Hawke's resolve. But Hawke wasn't going to fall for it. "Your games are over, Krulov," Hawke said, his voice steady, but inside, he could feel the pulse of uncertainty threatening to crack his composure. Krulov chuckled darkly. "Oh, but you still don't get it, do you? I'm not in control of anything. I never was." Hawke's finger tightened on the trigger, but he hesitated. Something wasn't right. Something had shifted, and the realization hit him like a blow to the chest. The cyber attack, the global markets, the global infrastructure collapse. It had all been carefully orchestrated, but it wasn't Krulov who had planned it all. It was someone else, someone even higher than Krulov, someone who had been pulling the strings from behind the scenes, using Krulov as a pawn in a much larger game. "You've been working for someone else, haven't you?" Hawke asked, his voice barely a whisper. Krulov's eyes narrowed, but there was a flicker of something. Fear? Panic? He quickly masked it with a smile, but the damage had been done. Hawke knew now that the mastermind wasn't the man standing before him. There was someone else. Who? Hawke demanded. Who's behind this? Krulov leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest, his gaze hardening. You really want to know? You think you're the hero, the one who's going to fix this. You're just another pawn in their game. You were always meant to be a tool, Hawke. A tool to clean up the mess after it all falls apart. You were never going to win. Tell me who's behind this? Hawke growled, stepping forward. But Krulov shook his head, his smirk growing. You'll find out soon enough, he said. But I won't be here to watch it. My part is over. Without another word, Krulov stood up, his movements slow and deliberate. He reached for a concealed device on his desk, and before Hawke could react, he pressed a button. The room went dark in an instant, the sound of a high-pitched alarm filling the space. You've already lost, Krulov whispered, his voice the last thing Hawke heard before the blackout consumed them both. A race against time. Hawke's world spun into darkness. The lights went out, the emergency alarms blaring in his ears. His hand shot out, grabbing the edge of the desk as he steadied himself, his mind now racing faster than his pulse. The room was empty. Krulov was gone. There was no time to waste. The entire compound was about to go into lockdown, and Hawke needed answers. The clock was ticking, and with each passing second, the stakes were getting higher. But there was no time to wonder how he'd been played. All that mattered now was stopping the person who had orchestrated the entire attack. He was being hunted, but he wasn't about to become the prey. Hawke sprinted toward the door, his hand slamming into the control panel as he bypassed the system's security protocols. He needed to get out. He needed to stop the attack, or the entire world would descend into chaos. This wasn't just about stopping Krulov anymore. This was about stopping an invisible force that had manipulated him, and countless others, into playing its game, the escape. As Hawke ran through the darkened halls of the compound, he felt the weight of the situation crushing him. Every hallway seemed to stretch longer than the last. Every shadow felt like it was hiding something. Someone waiting for him. The walls seemed to close in as the real danger began to set in. His earpiece crackled to life, and Katerina's voice filtered through. Hawke, what's going on? We've lost contact with you. The entire compound is on lockdown. I know, Hawke replied, his voice tight with urgency. But I've got a bigger problem. Krulov isn't the one behind all of this. There's someone else. Who? Katerina asked, her voice crackling with static. I don't know yet, but I'm about to find out. He reached the exit door and pushed it open, the cold night air hitting his face like a slap. He was outside now, but he could feel the eyes of 100 different enemies trained on him. He had no idea how much time he had left. He could feel it in his gut, Whoever was behind this was going to make sure he didn't make it out alive. The betrayal. As Hawke moved through the dark landscape outside the compound, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every step was calculated, every decision made in the blink of an eye. He had no choice but to keep moving, keep fighting, and pray that he could stay one step ahead. But as he approached the rendezvous point where his team was waiting, the unthinkable happened. A sharp, metallic click rang out in the distance, followed by the unmistakable sound of a sniper rifle being aimed at him. His heart stopped. He'd been set up. The entire operation, the entire mission. It had all been a lie. Hawke dove to the ground as the bullet whizzed past him, the explosion of sound filling the night air. He scrambled to his feet, looking for cover as the gunfire rang out again. But this time it wasn't just a sniper. There were men on the ground, soldiers closing in from every side. Hawke's mind raced. Who had betrayed him? Who had turned him into a target? Then, through the chaos, he saw her, Katerina. She was standing at the edge of the clearing, her gun raised, her eyes cold. Perfect shot. And she wasn't the ally he thought she was. She was the one who had orchestrated this all along. Hawke's heart sank as the betrayal hit him with the force of a freight train. He had trusted her. He had fought alongside her, but all of it had been a lie. You always were too trusting, Hawke, Katerina said, her voice devoid of any warmth. But you were never supposed to make it out of here alive. Chapter 10. The final move. Hawke's blood ran cold as he stared at Katerina, the woman who had betrayed him. His mind scrambled to process the overwhelming truth, but the more he thought about it, the clearer it became. Katerina was the mastermind. She was the one pulling the strings, orchestrating the chaos, and using him as a pawn in a game that he could never have fathomed. "You're with them," he said, his voice barely a whisper. His breath caught in his chest as he tried to steady his pulse, but the adrenaline pumping through his veins made every breath feel like a jagged blade. Katerina didn't respond with words. Instead, she leveled her gun at him with the precision of someone who had done it 100 times before. The barrel gleamed in the moonlight, and for a moment, everything else in the world faded to nothing. Hawke didn't have time to think. Every instinct screamed at him to move, to act before she could pull the trigger. But he knew, in that instant, that it was already too late. That he had been the one who had miscalculated. He had underestimated Katerina, trusted her too much, and now the consequences of his mistake were staring him in the face. No, there was still one last play he could make. With a burst of movement, Hawke dove to the side, rolling into the darkness just as the first shot rang out. The bullet sliced through the air where he had been standing only moments before. The force of the impact left a sharp ringing in his ears, but he didn't stop. He scrambled behind a tree, gasping for air as his body fought against exhaustion. His heart was thundering in his chest, but there was no room for fear. There was only the mission, only survival. "Hawke!" Katerina's voice rang out, cool and confident. "This game is over. Don't make it harder on yourself." She moved with precision, stalking toward his position, but Hawke's mind was already working, calculating his next move. He couldn't let her win. He couldn't let her control the narrative. Not after everything they'd been through. The truth was clear now. The cyber attacks, the crashes in global markets, the war games, everything had been a setup. and Katerina had been the one pulling the strings behind the scenes. It had all been part of a larger plan, a plot to manipulate power on a scale the world had never seen. But now, it was Hawke's turn to make the final move. Katerina stepped closer, the barrel of her gun still aimed in his direction, but as she stepped into the clearing, Hawke sprang into action. With the speed of someone trained in shadow operations, he lunged from his hiding spot, knocking the gun from her hand and sending it skidding across the ground. She tried to fight back, but Hawke was faster. His hand shot out, grabbing her by the wrist and twisting it, forcing her to the ground with a vicious crack. "You betrayed me," he said, his voice cold, devoid of any emotion. "You betrayed everything we fought for." Katerina gritted her teeth, her eyes flashing with the familiar fire he had once admired. "I did what had to be done," she spat. "You were never going to see the bigger picture, but now you will." Hawke looked down at her, and for a fleeting moment, he saw the woman he had trusted, the one he thought he had known. But now there was nothing left of her. She had become just another part of the system he had spent his life dismantling. Hawke raised his gun, his hand steady despite the rage boiling inside of him. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing on his chest. This was it, the final decision. "Who's behind all of this?" he demanded, his voice like ice. "Who's the one pulling the strings?" Katerina smirked, her lips curling in defiance. "You'll never know," she said with a twisted laugh. "But you were never meant to. You're just a piece on the board." Before Hawke could react, there was a sudden movement. A figure in the distance, stepping into the moonlight. A shadow, tall and imposing. A familiar face. It was Bishop. The shock hit Hawke like a punch to the gut. He had suspected Bishop might be involved, but he never imagined this level of betrayal. Bishop had been with him through everything, trusted him, trained him, and fought by his side. "Bishop!" Hawke's voice cracked, disbelief flooding his mind. Bishop stepped forward, his eyes cold and calculating. "You were never supposed to find out, Hawke," he said, his voice flat. "You were supposed to clean up the mess, and then you were supposed to disappear. But you're too good at this game. You're too dangerous." It all clicked into place. Bishop had been the one pulling the strings all along, the one who had orchestrated Hawke's path, guiding him into every trap, every mission, every betrayal. Hawke had been played from the very beginning. "Why?" Hawke asked, his voice barely a whisper, the weight of the betrayal sinking in. "Because it had to be this way," Bishop replied, his eyes never leaving Hawke's. "The world needs control, Hawke. It needs order. And I'm the one who's going to bring it." Katerina struggled against the ground beneath her, her eyes shifting between the two men. "You can't," she began, but Bishop silenced her with a single motion. Hawke's mind was racing. His options were few, and the reality of the situation was dawning on him. There was no way out, no way to stop them. They had already won. But then, as his gaze flicked from Bishop to Katerina, he saw something, a tiny, almost imperceptible flicker in her eyes. She wasn't completely aligned with Bishop. There was doubt there, a crack in her armor. It was his last chance. Without thinking, Hawke lunged at Katerina, grabbing her by the collar and pulling her close. He whispered into her ear, his voice barely audible. "If you want to stop this, you need to help me." For a moment, It seemed like she was going to betray him again, but then her hand shot out, grabbing a hidden gun from her waistband and shoving it into his hand. "Do it," she said, "before it's too late." In that split second, Hawke made the choice. With one swift motion, he turned the gun on Bishop, firing without hesitation. The Bishop's eyes widened in shock as he crumpled to the ground, his body collapsing in an instant. The game was over. Katerina scrambled to her feet, looking around in disbelief as the weight of the situation came crashing down on her. She had played her part, but in the end, Hawke had come out on top. Hawke's heart raced, but there was no joy in victory, no relief, just an overwhelming sense of exhaustion and loss. The battle was over, but the war, that was just beginning.